In continuation on the resumption of debate, questions without notice. Senator Watt.
Thank you, Mr President. My question is to the Minister representing the Minister for Health, Senator Colbeck. This morning, speaking about COVID vaccines, Senator Canavan called for the Morrison government to, and I quote, suspend the rollout here in Australia. Does Senator Canavan's position represent the government's position?
The Minister representing the Minister for Health and Aged Care, Senator Colbeck.
Thank you, Mr President, and thank Senator for his question. Mr President, Senator Canavan's position does not represent the government's position. I mean, I acknowledge the comments from Senator Canavan, Mr President, and I acknowledge his right to have a perspective, have a view on these things. Mr President, I acknowledge his perspective, but Mr President, as we have done all the way through this pandemic, Mr President, we, are taking the health advice with respect to the vaccine rollout, Mr President, and over recent days, with respect to the concerns that have been raised and the suspension of the vaccination rollout in a number of countries in Europe, our health agencies, particularly the TGA, have been in close contact with those agencies in Europe to understand what is occurring, Mr President, and also, Mr President, to assure ourselves that the vaccination rollout is safe to continue with, Mr President. And the TGA has issued a statement to that effect to indicate that the vaccination rollout is safe to continue with. Mr President, the ATAGI has issued a statement with respect to the rollout that it is safe to continue with, and Mr President, as has the Chief Medical Officer, who has issued a statement with relation to the safety of the rollout, Mr President. So we will continue to act on the health advice.
Order, Senator Colbeck.
In the
time
safe
for the
rollout of
answer
vaccination
has expired. Senator Watt, a supplementary question.
Thank you, Mr President. This morning, the Treasurer rejected Senator Canavan's calls to suspend the rollout, saying, and I quote, "They have not found any causal link between the vaccine and blood clots." Yet 10 minutes ago, Senator Canavan doubled down on his comments in a tweet. Who are the Australian people supposed to believe, Treasurer Frydenberg or Senator Canavan?
Senator Colbeck.
Thank you, Mr President. I would urge the Australian people, the Tasmanian people too, the Australian people to follow the advice that's been given to us by our world-leading health agencies, the TGA, one of the best agencies of its kind in the world, and I would urge the Australian people to follow that advice, Mr President. I would urge the Australian people to follow the advice of the Chief Medical Officer, Professor Kelly, and I would urge the Australian people to follow the advice of ATAGI, Mr President. So all of these agencies, including the Chief Medical Officer, have issued statement saying that there has been no causal link found between blood clotting and the vaccine, and that it is safe to continue with the rollout, Mr President. All of those agencies are in close contact with their sister agencies in Europe.
Senator Watt, a final supplementary question.
Senator Canavan's comments risk undermining confidence in Australia's health regulators. It would appear Senator Abetz might agree, and in the rollout of the COVID-19 vaccination program. Has this minister, the Minister for Health or the Prime Minister, addressed with Senator Canavan the comments he made this morning, and if not, why not?
Senator Colbeck.
Mr President, I am aware of a conversation between the Prime Minister and the Health Minister and Senator Canavan during a forum this morning where this matter was debated. So, Mr President, the views of the Prime Minister and the Health Minister are well known, Mr President, to Senator Canavan And, Mr President, I would urge, Mr President, the Australian people to take the world-leading advice of the TGA, ATAGI and the CMO, Mr President. I would urge the Australian people to follow that advice. In fact, I would urge all my colleagues to follow that advice, because that is the thing that will retain confidence in the rollout of the vaccine in this country, which is so important to us from a health perspective. It's so important to us from an economic perspective that we continue to safely roll out the vaccine in this country in the support of all Australians.
Order on my left. Before I come to you, Senator Patterson, I'd like to draw to the attention of honourable senators the presence in the gallery of the Ambassador of Japan to Australia, His Excellency Mr Yamagami Shingo. On behalf of all senators, I wish you a warm welcome to the Parliament and in particular to the Senate. Senator Patterson.
Thank you, Mr President. And my question is to the Minister for Foreign Affairs, Senator Payne. Can the Minister update the Senate on Australia's participation in the Quad Leaders Summit?
The Minister for Foreign Affairs, Senator Payne.
Thank you very much, Mr President, and thanks Senator Patterson for his question. It is timely indeed that His Excellency is in the gallery today for this question, because, Mr President, on Saturday I was pleased to join the Prime Minister for the first Quad Leaders meeting, which followed the third Quad Foreign Ministers meeting in February. The Quad brings together 4 like-minded democracies: Australia, India, Japan and the United States, united by a shared vision for a free, open, inclusive and resilient Indo-Pacific region. The Leaders' Summit was an historic moment that reinforces our support for a sovereign, resilient and stable Indo-Pacific. President Biden, Prime Ministers Morrison, Modi and Suga have set an ambitious, practical and positive agenda for key regional priorities. As the Prime Minister said at the beginning of the summit, history teaches us that when nations engage together in a partnership of strategic trust, of common hope and shared values, much can be achieved. This supports Australia's strategic interests, reflecting our belief in a region governed by rules, not by power. Through the Quad, Australia works with our close partners to support a region based on sovereignty and respect for international law. The Quad complements Australia's engagement in ASEAN-led, ASEAN-centred architecture and other bilateral, regional and multilateral groupings. All 4 Quad countries are strongly committed to ASEAN centrality, as well as the ASEAN outlook on the Indo-Pacific, and to working with regional partners to ensure a prosperous and secure region. Australia looks to our friends in achieving these goals, but, Mr President, we don't leave it to our friends. As our response to COVID-19 demonstrates, Australia will do our share of the lifting.
Answer has expired. Senator Patterson, a supplementary question.
Thank you, Mr President. Minister, how is Australia working with our key partners to secure and distribute COVID-19 vaccines in the Pacific and Southeast Asia?
Senator Payne.
Thank you, Mr President. And in the spirit, indeed, of our important response to the 2004 Boxing Day tsunami, Quad leaders launched a landmark partnership on Saturday to support our region's recovery from COVID-19. Together, we're taking action to expand safe and effective COVID-19 vaccine manufacturing and delivery in 2021. Reflecting our respective strengths, our investments will ramp up vaccine manufacturing capacity, fund the procurement and distribution of vaccines and provide last-mile delivery support. Building on the government's existing commitment of a $523 million regional vaccine access and health security program, Australia has pledged an additional $100 million to be allocated in consultation between Quad partners. Wherever possible, Quad partners will take opportunities to implement joint or closely coordinated programs of support for our partner countries in the Indo-Pacific, with a particular focus on Southeast Asia.
Senator Patterson, a final supplementary question.
Thank you, Mr President. Minister, how will the Quad framework assist to deepen Australia's cooperation with India, Japan and the US on key emerging issues in our region?
Senator Payne.
Thank you very much, Mr President. And I want to note, Mr President, that Quad leaders in particular underscored that climate change is a global priority and, of course, a risk to Indo-Pacific resilience. We have established a new Quad climate working group to strengthen climate action and advance the low emissions technology required to achieve net zero emissions as soon as possible. We've also established a critical and emerging technology working group, recognising that a free, open, inclusive and resilient Indo-Pacific requires that critical technology is governed according to shared interests and values. That builds on the Quad's existing agenda, agreed by foreign ministers at our own meeting in Tokyo last October. And that agenda includes cooperation on maritime security, on infrastructure, on supply chain resilience, on counter-terrorism, on cyber and on countering disinformation. I particularly look forward to taking forward this important work with my counterparts, Indian External Affairs Minister Jaishankar, Japanese Foreign Minister Motegi and US Secretary of State Blinken.
The answer has expired. Senator McAllister.
Thanks very much, Mr President. My question is to the Minister for Women, Senator Payne. On the treatment of women in the parliament, the Minister for Women has said, and I quote, "The only way it will change is if we, as parliamentarians, own the problems, own the failings and make the necessary changes." Attorney-General Porter has sat on the Respect at Work report for a year, responding to only 3 of the 55 recommendations. Will the Minister for Women call on the Attorney-General to own his failings and make the necessary changes to implement the remaining 52 recommendations 1 year on?
The Minister for Women, Senator Payne.
Thank you very much, Mr President. The government has taken a number of steps to address a component of the recommendations addressed to the Commonwealth. Those recommendations were outlined in the Women's Economic Security Statement process through the budget, Mr President, and the government is actively considering the remaining recommendations in detail with a view to continuing to implement that response as soon as possible this year. I want to acknowledge the work that's being done by Senator the Honourable Amanda Stoker, the new Assistant Minister to the Attorney-General, in that regard. Of course, Mr President, additionally, Safe Work Australia has been doing very important work in this space, including by releasing its sexual harassment in the workplace guidance earlier this year. I would also, Mr President, refer to the Sex Discrimination Commissioner's words in relation to the report, acknowledging, and as I did in fact in a question asked of me recently also, that COVID did, along with a number of matters before government at the time, did have an impact on this process, that a number of the key recommendations have been funded, in particular looking at the next survey, getting together the Workplace Sexual Harassment Council and some education and training resources. I do want to note, Mr President, and those opposite seek to ignore this, but I do think it is actually important to acknowledge that as a report about workplaces, the report's recommendations are not limited to government alone. While the government naturally has had to direct its resources to immediate priorities, I think the Commissioner has also been encouraged in the level of influence she's seeing the report have in workplaces, the main subject of its concern over the past year. And I said in response to a question last week, and I'm not sure from whom that question came, Mr President, but I did say in response to a question last week or the week before that the report also involves other governments, Mr President, plus business in particular, and a number of agencies, including Safe Work that I've already referred to, Fair Work Australia. It is not an entirely Commonwealth government-led report.
Has expired. Senator McAllister, a supplementary question.
Thank you. Does the Minister for Women consider it appropriate that the Attorney-General, Mr Porter, remain the Cabinet Minister responsible for the Respect at Work report?
Senator Payne.
Thank you very much, Mr President. The Attorney-General, who is currently on a period of leave, the Acting Attorney-General, Minister Cash, here in this chamber, the Attorney-General has outlined very clearly his position in relation to the issues to which Senator McAllister alludes. Mr President, this country operates on the basis of the rule of law and the presumption of innocence, and it is not possible to be selective about to whom that should and should not apply. The Attorney-General has initiated certain proceedings of his own motion in relation to a number of these matters. I would also note, Mr President, as I have said in this chamber previously and as I have made clear again today, that in relation to the Respect at Work report, that work is being carried out by the newly appointed Assistant Minister, Senator the Honourable Amanda Stoker.
Senator McAllister, a final supplementary question.
In both of her answers to date and previously when asked about this report, this minister has deferred responsibility to the junior assisting minister, Senator Stoker. Will the Minister for Women listen to Australian women, step up and take responsibility for doing her bit to ensure that the 55 recommendations are finally implemented?
Senator Payne.
Thank you very much, Mr President. There's a number of issues that have been raised, including through the terms of the petition presented to the Parliament yesterday, and they did support the adoption of the 55 recommendation in the Human Rights Commission's Respect at Work report. I've already indicated that those are being considered, Mr President, through the appropriate portfolio minister, actually, Mr President, and in terms of recommendations that I was able to address, Minister, those recommendations were addressed, including with funding, in the Women's Economic Security Statement in October last year. So the full response, as I said, will be brought forward by the Assistant Minister to the Attorney-General, Senator Stoker. But there's a number of recommendations, Mr President. For example, the ratification of the ILO's Convention on Eliminating Violence and Harassment in the World of Work. Well, if you knew anything about the implementation of such matters, Senator Keeley, then you would know that the government's approach to ratifying treaties is now
Senator Payne,
consistent
time for the
with us.
answer has expired. Order. I was struggling to hear the minister during that answer. Senator Faruqi.
Thank you, Mr President. My question is to the minister representing the Prime Minister, Senator Birmingham. Yesterday marked the 2-year anniversary of the far-right terrorist attack in Christchurch, New Zealand, when an Australian man killed 51 innocent Muslims. On 9 December 2020, following the publication of the New Zealand Royal Commission report, I asked you, Minister, whether the Prime Minister had read the report and how the government intended to respond to it. You gave me a commitment that the government will examine the report thoroughly, all 44 of its recommendations, engage with the New Zealand government on how it is implementing the recommendations and consider any and all implications for the operation of our own counter-terrorism policies and practices. More than 3 months have passed, Minister. Has the Prime Minister read the report? Has the government spoken with the New Zealand counterparts about it? And when will the Australian government respond to the report?
Minister representing the Prime Minister, Senator Birmingham.
Thanks, Mr President. Well, the very important work that Senator Faruqi identifies in terms of the response to right-wing extremism, to extremism in all its forms where it poses a threat to the safety or social cohesion of Australia, is an ongoing piece of work that our government has taken seriously for many years and continues to take very seriously, including in relation to learning the lessons from the tragic Christchurch massacre and learning from the elements of the New Zealand report and investigations that are relevant to Australia. And our government agencies, in relation to their responses and the advice that they will provide as to what further or additional steps need to be taken in Australia, will absolutely draw upon that work as we draw upon all expert evidence in relation to such important matters. Just in the last budget, our government provided a further $571 million over the next 5 years to our security agencies to keep Australians safe. These are the security agencies that Senator Faruqi rightly quotes in terms of having identified areas of rise in right-wing extremism that we need to confront, as well as having identified other areas of extremism that we need to confront. These agencies, ASIO in particular, has the highest level of funding in its 70-year history. And this year's budget, our government has invested and continues to invest some $300 million to enhance the AFP's capacity to respond to emerging threats. There's no place in our community for any group or individual who seeks to promote disharmony.
Senator Faruqi on a point of order. Senator Faruqi.
Mr President, point of order is to relevance. I really asked specifically about the New Zealand Royal Commission report. Has the Prime Minister read it, and when will the government respond?
That was definitely the final part of your question, Senator Faruqi. It was a long question. I've allowed you to remind the Minister of that. The Minister has 14 seconds remaining. Senator Birmingham.
Thanks, Mr President. The New Zealand report was not a report to the Australian government, but it is a valued input in terms of an additional source of information that will inform the continued investment and policy making our government makes in relation to these important issues.
Senator Faruqi, a supplementary question.
Minister, government MPs have repeatedly sought to draw false equivalences between right-wing and left-wing extremism. In its recent submission to the PJCIS inquiry into extremism, ASIO states that the threat from extreme right-wing groups has increased, with groups being more organised and sophisticated than before. Conversely, on left-wing extremism, ASIO states that it is not currently prominent in Australia. Will government MPs stop drawing false equivalences between extreme right-wing and left-wing groups?
Time for the question has expired. Senator Birmingham.
Thanks, Mr President. The laws, the policy, the funding, the operation of our security agencies are ideologically agnostic. Whether extremism is right-wing extremism, whether it is religiously motivated extremism, whatever the cause of such extremism, we focus very clearly on dealing with those threats, dealing with the potential criminality, dealing with the risks to Australia. Prevention initiatives that are supported across the country in terms of tackling areas of extremist ideology. Now, I'll take Senator Keneally's intervention. The ideology matters in relation to dealing with the threats and seeking to minimise them. But there is not a singular ideology that poses a threat to Australia. If you sit down and ask our security agencies, they will tell you that, Senator Keneally. The threats of religious extremism, the threats of right-wing extremism remain very real, very significant, and are.
Senator Keneally. Senator Keneally. Senator Faruqi, a final supplementary question.
Minister, will the government condemn far-right extremism without equivocation? Yes or no?
Senator Birmingham.
Mr President, as I have done before in this chamber, I condemn right-wing extremism without any qualification. I condemn religious extremism without any qualification. I condemn all forms of extremism that pose threat or violence or undermine safety without any form of qualification. I acknowledge absolutely the work of ASIO, as I have done in this chamber before, and it is as a result of the record funding and investment and legislative approaches this government has put in place that agencies like ASIO have been in a position to identify those threats, to work to respond to those threats, and that we will continue to support them without any qualification and without any bias towards the threats that are posed to Australia, to make sure that they are empowered to continue to do so.
Senator Griff.
Thank you, Mr President. My question is to Minister Hume, representing the Minister for Communications. The pandemic crisis has been a time of heightened stress, anxiety and depression, and has worsened gambling addiction in vulnerable Australians. Online bookies have made a killing during the pandemic. In Australia, credit cards can be used when gambling online, but credit cards cannot be used offline in a licensed gambling venue or casino. The UK banned the use of credit cards for both online and offline betting in April last year, recognising that this will significantly reduce the extent of harm to vulnerable people. Why does the Morrison government still allow online betting with credit cards and not legislate to ban the practice as the UK has done?
The Minister representing the Minister for Communications, Urban Infrastructure and the Arts, Senator Hume.
Thank you, Mr President, and thank you, Senator Griff, for your question and for your ongoing commitment to vulnerable Australians, in particular in areas of problem gambling. You're correct. Last year, the UK have banned gamblers from using credit cards to pay for bets, and that's for both online and offline gambling, and it also applies to e-wallets, which is a new pattern that we're seeing emerging in paying for online betting. In the name of consumer protection, that's been particularly because of evidence and anecdote of online gambling has increased throughout the period of coronavirus in the UK, and there's also anecdotal evidence that that has occurred in Australia as well. Now, as you'd know, Regulation of gambling and gaming is predominantly a state-based responsibility. However, the government is always interested to learn what's being done in other jurisdictions to protect vulnerable communities. And there's no doubt that digital technologies like e-wallets are rapidly changing the way that people choose to gamble. In November 2018, the Coalition Government, in conjunction with state and territory governments, launched the National Consumer Protection Framework for online wagering in Australia to provide much stronger consumer protections for Australians who are gambling online. And they included things like prohibition of online wagering services from offering credit, providing credit to people who gamble on their site or on an app. It included things like prohibition of use of payday lenders for online betting. It required customer verification requirements, restrictions on inducement and account closures, including voluntary opt-out pre-commitment schemes, activity statements and consistent gambling messages, as well as staff training and the National Inclusion Register. Now, the Commonwealth will be responsible for implementing measures such as this new online National Self-Exclusion Register, which allows people to self-exclude from all online wagering sites and apps
time
in
for
one
the
go.
answer has expired. Senator Griff, a supplementary question.
Minister, you are correct with gambling falling under states, but credit cards fall under federal, so that's where it's appropriate that it's dealt with here. Now, last year I introduced legislation to ban the use of credit cards for online gambling. I wrote to the Minister for Communications on the issue, and his response was, and I'll quote, "The implementation of a ban on the use of credit cards to deposit funds into online wagering accounts is not currently within the scope of the Morrison government's online gambling reforms." End of quote. Why is such a reform not within the scope?
Senator Griff. Senator Hume.
Thank you, Mr President, and again, thank you, Senator Griff. I can say to you that in December 2019, the Australian Bankers Association, the ABA, released a consultation paper seeking the views of the public on exactly this issue, the use of credit cards in gambling, and submissions to that process closed in March last year. Now, Minister Fletcher and Minister Ruston, as the relevant ministers, are due to meet with the ABA on this very issue in the coming weeks. As I said before, the state and territory governments have the primary responsibility for the regulation and licensing of providers and the premises also in which gambling products are available. And the government will continue to monitor this issue to determine whether government intervention is required. However, in the meantime, the National Self-Exclusion Register is just one measure of the national framework for which the Commonwealth Government is responsible, and self-exclusion is a consumer protection tool aimed at individuals who are at risk of or who are already experiencing significant levels of harm from online wagering.
Senator Griff, a final supplementary question.
Coalition MP Andrew Wallace has recently advocated for a ban on the use of credit cards for online bets and met with major banks who are all apparently, and I'll quote, in furious agreement that action is needed. In fact, in the story of a week ago, the ANZ Bank is quoted as being 100% in agreement. Has the government met with any particular bank on this issue? And you did state that you were also meeting with the ABA. And what action has been taken?
Senator Griff. Senator Hume.
Thank you, Mr President. Senator Griff, I personally haven't met with any bank on this particular issue, but as we said, Senator Fletcher and Minister Fletcher and Minister Ruston will be meeting with the ABA, who represent the banks collectively, and will be discussing this issue further. In the meantime, the National Self-Exclusion Register, as I said, is only one measure. In 2019, legislation passed in this very place to enable the establishment of that register, and the register will allow those who are experiencing gambling harm to immediately exclude themselves from the services that are offered by all interactive wagering service providers with the click of one button. So the implementation of this register is very much on track. The request for tender is currently underway to select an organisation to operate that register. And although many individual Australian interactive gambling providers currently offer consumers the option to exclude themselves from opening an account with that particular provider, there is no national self-exclusion system available that applies to all providers, so this is a significant leap forward.
Senator Keneally.
My question is to the Minister for Women, Senator Payne. In reflecting on the tens of thousands of women who marched for justice across the country, the Prime Minister said, and I quote, "Not far from here, such marches, even now, are being met with bullets." This morning, the Minister for Women said the observation was, and I quote, "an important one." Is the Minister for Women really endorsing the Prime Minister when he tells Australian women they should feel lucky that they weren't shot?
Order. I'll call the minister when I have the opportunity to hear her. The Minister for Women, Senator Payne. Order. Order across the chamber. Reset the clock, and I'll commence it when I call the minister again. Order. Order. Senator Payne.
Thank you, Mr. President. In a democracy, like Australia, Mr. President, there are a number of rights, responsibilities and privileges that I think many Australians overwhelmingly treasure and value. One of those, Mr. President, is the opportunity to protest, peaceful demonstrations and peaceful exercises like the one that was undertaken yesterday. Unfortunately, Mr. President, there are too many countries around the world where those privileges, those rights are not extended. Too many countries where democratic values that underpin our democratic system are not extended to many
Senator
people.
Payne, I'm going to ask you to I'm going to ask senators that when I do use their names to at least have some break before they start breaching standing orders again. Senator Payne.
Those democratic values, Mr. President, are not extended to their populations, and in that regard, Australia is a fortunate country. Not very far from here, Mr. President, in a number of places around the world where we have seen recent activities of protest and demonstration, we have seen those met by violence from authorities.
Order.
And in that case, Mr. President, the values of the Australian democracy should be at the forefront of all of our minds.
Order. Senator Keneally.
Thank you, Mr. President. Even Senator Rennick, on the minister's own side, said that the Minister for Women should have attended yesterday's March for Justice. Is Senator Rennick wrong? And does the Minister for Women stand by her decision not to attend the March for Justice yesterday?
Senator Payne. Senator Watt.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. I answered that question in here yesterday. I answered that question again last night, and I answered it again this morning. And frankly, Mr. President, I want to reiterate the offer of the Prime Minister that still stands to meet with the organisers of yesterday's protest and rally. It's an offer that the Prime Minister continues to extend.
Senator Keneally on a point of order. Senator Keneally.
With respect, I'm not sure how the minister can claim she answered a question yesterday to an event that only happened today. That is, that Senator Rennick said today she should have attended the event. Is Senator Rennick wrong?
Senator Keneally, the question also asked whether the minister stood by the decision they made, and I think, with respect, the minister is being directly relevant to that. The question concluded. Senator Keneally, a final supplementary question.
Guess we won't know if Senator Rennick is wrong. Political reporter Brett Worthington said this morning, and I quote, "For the tens of thousands of Australian women who rallied around the nation, they were looking for signs that the nation's leaders were listening. What they heard was a Prime Minister who said they should be thankful they weren't shot." When will the Morrison government start listening to women, stop telling them they should feel lucky that they aren't shot, and start taking their concerns seriously?
Order, Senator Keneally. Senator Payne.
Mr. President, a number of issues in recent weeks in this parliament and elsewhere, including, may I say, some of the very impactful speeches made by people like Australian of the Year, Grace Tame, speeches made, including at yesterday's rally, Mr. President, have have led to a very significant debate in this country about matters that go to the core of a number of fundamental issues for Australian women. And in that context, Mr President, we have taken a number of steps as a parliament. And for a period, those opposite engaged constructively and positively with the Minister for Finance, Special Minister of State, in his efforts to ensure that this parliament is provided with an independent review to be carried out by the Sex Discrimination Commissioner.
Senator Payne, time for the answer has expired. Senator Abetz.
Thank you, Mr President. My question is to the Minister representing the Treasurer, Senator Birmingham. Can the Minister advise on how the Liberal National Party government's economic recovery plan is working to support families, households, businesses and jobs as our economy recovers from the COVID-19 pandemic?
The Minister representing the Treasurer, Senator Birmingham.
Well, thanks, Mr President. I thank Senator Abetz for his question. I know his champion endlessly of the opportunities for job creations for Australians across Tasmania, but right across our land. And indeed, as Australia continues to recover from the biggest economic shock since the Great Depression, we can be buoyed by the continuing progress that is being made, particularly by the strength of consumer and business confidence. The NAB's measure of business confidence in February remained well above its long-run average level. All elements of Westpac's Consumer Sentiment Index have improved over the last year, and consumer confidence is up some 21.6% over the year, close to a 10-year high. The latest OECD Economic Outlook suggests, Mr President, that the Australian economy declined by only 2.5% in 2020, a significant improvement on the IMF's October forecast, and indeed a vastly better outcome than, for example, the US at 3.5% decline, the euro area at 6.5% decline, or the UK at effectively a 10% decline. And indeed, our recovery was showing great strength through the final 2 quarters of last year, and in the December quarter, real GDP increased by 3.1%, leading the OECD to upgrade its forecast for Australia's economic growth in 2021 to 4.5%, a significant lift from their forecast just back in December. Australia is one of just 9 countries to have a AAA credit rating from all 3 of the ratings agencies, and all of this strength in our recovery is translating most crucially into jobs. Jobs for Australians that are seeing employment growth, unemployment decreasing to 6.4%, 94% of the jobs lost at the start of the pandemic having come back, and indeed more than half of the jobs created in the last 8 months, pleasingly, going to women across Australia.
Senator Abetz, a supplementary question.
I thank the Minister for that good news, especially on the jobs front, and I ask, can the Minister also update the Senate on how the government's plan for lower taxes is putting money back into the pockets of our fellow Australians and helping to boost the nation's economic recovery?
Senator Birmingham.
Thanks, Mr President. Well, indeed, our income tax reforms as a government are a crucial part of the economic recovery that is occurring and the ongoing support that will be there for Australian households, not just this month or next month, but ongoing into the future. Our income tax cuts have already put some $9 billion back into the pockets of around 8.8 million Australians, supporting economic recovery, driving consumer and business confidence. The Stage 2 tax cuts brought forward in last year's budget will deliver a further $12 billion boost to hard-working Australian taxpayers over the period from now through until September 2021. This means that someone earning around $60,000 will be paying more than $2,100 less tax compared to 2017-18. That's more money in their household to support spending, to support investment and to continue to drive the economic recovery forward.
Order. Senator Abetz, a final supplementary question.
Thank you, Mr President. Can the Minister outline how the government's other measures will further support the transition to the next phase of our economic recovery and any risks that Australia faces on our road to recovery?
Senator Birmingham.
Thanks, Mr President. Well, our direct economic and health support since the start of the pandemic now stands at some $267 billion. We've outlined the next targeted steps of investment to support parts of Australia, regional parts of Australia, industries in Australia who continue to face difficulties in relation to the pandemic. We have ongoing measures in place, but we are shifting in terms of the temporary and targeted nature to make sure we stick to those principles of proportionality outlined at the beginning. And can I welcome, in fact, the statement of the Leader of the Opposition today, where he said, we obviously do need to shift away. These mechanisms won't be in place forever. That indeed is very correct. Leader of the Opposition's comments stand in contrast to the member for Maribyrnong, who happened to be out in the media this morning, the former Leader of the Opposition. He said, what's the point of tax cuts? What's the point of tax cuts? Well, Mr President, those on this side understand very clearly tax cuts put more money into the pockets of Australians, give them more capability to
Senator
support,
Birmingham,
to invest
for the
and to continue to support our...
Senator Birmingham. Senator Lambie.
Thank you, Mr President. My question is for the Minister representing the Minister for Health, Minister Colbeck. Minister, Spain, Germany, France, Cyprus, Italy, Portugal, Netherlands and Ireland have hit pause on the AstraZeneca rollout while they look into its potential links to blood clots. Your colleague, Senator Canavan, said today that Australia should follow suit. Why is the Minister for Health telling Australians there's no need to worry when health officials in 8 different countries are putting on the brakes?
The Minister representing the Minister for Health and Aged Care, Senator Colbeck.
Thank you, Mr President. Thanks, Senator Lambie, for the question. As I said earlier in question time today, the government continues to follow the advice of Australia's world-leading Therapeutic Goods Administration and also the other health authorities that advise us and have advised us so successfully through the course of the COVID-19 pandemic. So in this circumstance, ATAGI, who provide advice to us, has put out a statement noting the suspension of AstraZeneca in other countries, but it's also noted as a part of that statement that the rates of thrombotic events are not higher in the vaccine recipients than the expected background rate. Now, Mr President, these events are an issue that health authorities do keep an eye on as a part of the process. And our authorities here in Australia maintain and continuous and close contact with authorities in Europe, particularly the EMA and the MHRA, the UK authorities, where over 11 million doses have been dispensed of the AstraZeneca vaccine without seeing an incidence of increase of these sorts of events. So we maintain close contact with those authorities, and the government continues to act on the advice of the TGA, ATAGI and the Chief Medical Officer, Professor Kelly, in continuing a safe rollout of this vaccine across the country, which we all acknowledge is extremely important for the health of the Australian community, but also the economic recovery of the Australian economy from the COVID-19 virus. So we continue to act on that professional advice, and that's the advice that we will follow as the rollout continues, and the government believes that that's the appropriate process to follow.
Senator Lambie, a supplementary question.
Thank you, Mr President. This isn't just about science, this is about trust. And Australians didn't trust the Minister for Health enough to sign on to the COVID Safe app. He spent $14 million on that app, and half of that was on advertising. A year later, and it's only found a handful of COVID contacts. If Australians didn't trust the Health Minister enough to put an app on their phones, why would they trust him enough to put a vaccine in their arms?
Senator Colbeck.
Thank you, Mr President. Well, Senator Lambie, through you, Mr President, in my answer to the last question, my references with respect to who Australians should listen to and who they should trust with respect to this vaccine is the government, but via the advice that we receive, that we have all received from the TGA, ATAGI, and people like the Chief Medical Officer, Professor Kelly, and of course ably assisted and led through the Department of Health by Professor Murphy, who's the Secretary of the Department and who's been leading the process of the vaccination rollout. Mr President, Senator Lambie is quite correct. This is a very, very important process for us. We need to maintain trust in the process, which is why we continue to rely on the advice of ATAGI, of the TGA and the CMO in close contact with European authorities.
Expired. Senator Lambie, a final supplementary question.
Thank you, Mr. President. People in this building can deny it until they're blue in the face, but the reality is, and this is the reality, that there's a growing lack of trust in the vaccine that's going on out there. People are saying they're losing confidence that the vaccines we have in Australia are safe and effective. Why have we tied the fate of our economic recovery to the success of the AstraZeneca vaccine, to the point where we're all forced to say everything's fine while the vaccine itself is starting to roll off the rails?
Senator Colbeck.
Well, Mr. President, I thank Senator Lambie for the question, but I wouldn't agree with the assertion that she placed at the end of her question. The vaccination process in this country is continuing to ramp up. We are continuing to receive supplies of both the Pfizer and the AstraZeneca vaccine, and other vaccines may come online to support the vaccination of Australians as the approval process continues, as we get access, say, through the COVAX mechanism, where we do have capacity coming online, Mr. President. And so Australians can be confident. And, Mr. President, I have to say, in my experience and the feedback that I've been getting, for example, from aged care facilities, there is significant confidence and significant demand, Mr. President. Significant demand from senior Australians for the vaccination process, where we have over 40,000 Australians who have currently been vaccinated in over 500 aged care facilities. So there is strong demand,
Senator
in my experience,
time for the
vaccination
answer has expired. Senator McCarthy.
Thank you, Mr. President. My question is to the Minister for Women, Senator Payne. The government promised new school teaching materials on consent and respectful relationships back in the 2015 Plan for Women's Safety. But the Education Minister only announced the rollout in classrooms last week, a 6-year delay. A student could have started and finished primary school in that time. Has the Minister for Women taken any action to find out why these important materials have been so delayed?
The Minister for Women, Senator Payne.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. I don't have details with me of the education aspects of that matter. I am aware that the Minister for Education did, in his remarks last week, make reference to these issues and to the bravery of the young women in particular who had come forward as a result of the discussion of these very, very difficult issues in Australia, including sexual assault and rape, to disclose their own experiences. As I understand it, we have education materials in relation to the teaching of primary and secondary students about ethical behaviour, about consent and respectful relationships through what is known as the Respect Matters program, and that material will be freely available for use in all Australian schools in the coming weeks. The program for Foundation to Year 6, Mr. President, is focused on relationships and friendships and managing these through changes and challenges. That is about providing building blocks for later content. The program for Years 7 to 9 focuses on moving from preteen to adolescence and looks at relationships and power and bullying and bystander action. And then further, Mr. President, the program for Years 10 to 12 focuses on personal and intimate relationships. That includes understanding consent and decision-making and consent laws and rights. Mr. President, the government understands that this is a much broader issue than just schools, and significant funding has been allocated since 2013 by governments, federal and state and territory, but $1 billion from the Commonwealth to prevent and respond to violence against women and their children.
Has expired. Senator McCarthy, a supplementary question.
Yes, Mr. President. Can the Minister for Women confirm she has failed to implement the recommendations in the 2016 COAG report on reducing violence against women and their children, and the 2018 statement from delegates at the COAG summit on reducing violence against women and their children? If yes, why?
Senator Payne.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. As the senator would be aware, we as a government, like previous governments, in fact commencing in 2010 with strong multi-partisan, I would say, support, Mr President, have been supporters of, engaged in, leading on the National Action Plan to prevent violence against women and their children. Part of that is underpinned by the engagement of women's safety ministers from the states and territories with the Commonwealth ministers, Minister Ruston and I and myself at this point in time. And that is the framework under which the Commonwealth works and the states and territories work on all of these issues. In relation to those individual reports, Mr President, if I have anything further to add, I will bring further information to the chamber.
Senator McCarthy, a final supplementary question.
The CEO of Community Legal Centres Australia has warned that the government's move to abolish the specialist family court model risks, and I quote, exposing survivors of family violence to unnecessary risk. What action did the Minister for Women take to protect women and children from the risk of Attorney-General Porter's move to abolish the family court?
Senator Payne.
Thank you very much, Mr President. And as senators would be aware, there was a very extensive consultation on the introduction of the reforms to the courts that Senator McCarthy has alluded to, and this is a very important priority for the government within the family law system. I understand there's also been a report released this week in relation to matters affecting the court system and specifically with relation to family law. There's a number of initiatives, Mr President, which were part of the Women's Economic Security Statement as well in October of last year in the context of the budget that also went to these issues in the context, of course, at the time, overwhelmingly of COVID-19. Yesterday, in discussions with a number of community organisation representatives, including Ms Lynch from the Women's Legal Service, if I have the title of the organisation correct, in Queensland, a number of these matters were raised, Mr President.
Answer has expired. Senator Davey.
Thank you, Mr President. My question is to the Minister representing the Minister for Infrastructure, Transport and Regional Development, Senator Cash. Regional communities rely on aviation services to support small business, tourism and the residents who live there to access employment opportunities as well as vital services such as medical treatment and education. Virgin has previously withdrawn services from regional areas, and in the last week of February, Rex Airlines announced plans to cut some of its regional services. This has concerned many rural and regional Australians reliant on these vital services. Can the Minister please outline how the Liberal and National Government is supporting regional aviation to maintain as many of these essential air services, not only for tourism, but also for the viability of our communities in rural and regional Australia?
The Minister representing the Minister for Infrastructure, Transport and Regional Development, Senator Cash.
Thank you, Mr President, and I thank Senator Davey for her question. And Mr President, without a doubt, 2020 presented the domestic aviation network with the greatest challenges it has ever faced. And the Morrison-McCormack government, we were proud to support the domestic aviation network through these challenges. And that was actually demonstrated again last week when we announced a $1.2 billion package to support the tourism sector, to encourage more Australians to have a holiday domestically, but in particular in regional Australia. Mr President, we know that when the pandemic first hit, aviation, without a doubt, was hit, and it was hit hard. The government at that time, we put in place key supports to keep essential services running throughout the pandemic, not only to support regional airlines, but also ensuring that they can keep as many jobs as possible, Senator Davey, that are actually supported by our regions. Currently, there are around 12 commercial regional airlines which operate regular scheduled passenger services across Australia. It's almost 1 year today that the government announced its initial package to assist regional airlines to support critical air services to regional and rural communities, securing access to critical medical supplies and testing, securing freight and securing transport of essential personnel through the Regional Aviation Support Program. Mr President, you'd also be aware that the government provided an additional $100 million in funding to directly support the smaller regional airlines if they need it. And the reason we did this is because those regional airlines are critical supports for regional communities, providing critical aeromedical services and links to capital and metropolitan areas for medical appointments, medical freight and locum doctors. And certainly we are committed to ensuring that these services continue.
Senator Davey, a supplementary question.
Thank you. So the $1.2 billion Tourism Aviation Network Support Program, or TANS, as my leader likes to call it, announced last week and will initially service 13 key tourism regions. But can the minister please outline the future measures that our government will undertake to promote tourism and maintain the maintenance of key air services in the regions not currently included in that program?
Senator Cash.
Well, Mr President, prior to COVID-19, Australians spent approximately $65 billion on overseas travel in 2019. This presents now enormous opportunities for our regions. That's $65 billion in 2019 on overseas travel. What we are doing as a government is supporting more Australians to back our regions and to support Australians to holiday at home this year. We've announced, as you know, the half-price ticket program last week, which will initially operate in over 13 key regions, with the potential for more regions to be added on the basis of consumer demand, consultation and the success of the program. Mr President, in addition to this, the vital domestic aviation policies that are supporting our regional airlines, regional health systems and regional jobs, they'll continue for 6 months from the end of March to the end of September 2021. Again, as a government,
Senator
we will
Cash,
always
time
back
for the answer
our
has
regions.
expired. Senator Davey, a final supplementary question.
Yes. Can the minister please outline how Australians living in regional areas, and not just the holidaymakers who live in our capital cities, will be able to access the subsidised airline tickets under the program?
Senator Cash.
Well, Mr President, all Australians will have access to these fares through airline websites and booking agents in the coming weeks for flight bookings from the 1st of April. The discounts will be offered on tens of thousands of fares per week across an initial 13 key tourism regions, and the government is working with airlines to increase the number of flights to these tourism areas. Mr President, not only will regional Australians benefit, but regional airlines, regional accommodation providers, regional restaurants and bars and regional tourism operators. They will all benefit from the policy put in place by the government. But in particular, I would encourage all Australians, if you are considering taking advantage of the discount fare, book through a travel agent. Book through a travel agent, not just to support the local business, but also to ensure that you can actually make the most of your travel and experience in terms of what all of our regions have to offer. Doing this will obviously support those local travel agent
Senator
businesses.
Cash, time for the answer has expired. Senator Gallagher.
Thank you, Mr President. My question is to the Minister representing the Prime Minister, Senator Birmingham. I refer to reports that key components of the Attorney-General Christian Porter's job will be delegated to others upon his return from leave on the 31st of March. Are the reports correct? What responsibilities will be delegated? Why are these regarded as areas in which Mr Porter will face a conflict of interest, and who will be assisting Mr Porter?
The Minister representing the Prime Minister, Senator Birmingham.
Thanks, Mr President. I thank the Senator for her question. As the Attorney-General announced yesterday, he is exercising the same rights as any other Australian when they believe they have been defamed to initiate legal proceedings against certain organisations and individuals. To ensure appropriate handling whilst the Attorney-General initiates such proceedings, the government has sought legal advice in relation to any issues that may arise as a result of the Attorney-General filing such proceedings. As an interim measure, until that advice is received, the Attorney-General's office will have no engagement with the Federal Court which would be expected to hear the proceedings, understand, or involvement with matters involving the Federal Court or the Australian Broadcasting Corporation. The Attorney-General's Department has similarly been told not to engage with the Attorney-General or the Attorney-General's Office in respect of matters involving the Federal Court or the Australian Broadcasting Corporation.
Order. Senator Gallagher, a supplementary question.
Thank you. The next meeting of the Attorneys-General will be on the 31st of March, the day Mr Porter returns from leave, at which it will discuss two of its priorities: family violence, National Information Sharing Framework, and model defamation reform. Will Mr Porter attend the meeting, and if so, how will he manage his clear conflict of interest on two of the meeting's three identified priorities?
Senator Birmingham.
Mr President, I'm not aware of what Mr Porter's commitments will be on the 31st of March, and I'll take that on notice.
Senator Gallagher, a final supplementary question.
Thank you. It's reported that the Attorney-General's portfolio will be restructured to ensure Mr Porter is able to return to the role while he pursues defamation action. How long will a junior Attorney-General be required to assist Mr Porter to remain in Cabinet while questions remain over whether he is a fit and proper person to resume full responsibilities?
Senator Birmingham.
Thanks, Mr President. Well, as I said in relation to the primary question, the Attorney-General is exercising the same rights as any Australian in relation to initiating defamation proceedings in the belief that he has been defamed. Out of an abundance of caution, the government has sought legal advice in relation to the Attorney-General's work as an interim measure until that advice has been received. The steps that I outlined in relation to the primary question will be undertaken. Once that advice is received, if there's any further information to add, I'll make sure that it's brought to the chamber. Mr President, I ask that further questions be placed on notice.